AstLibra Revision has been getting a slight amount of buzz online, and I predict that buzz is going to eventually turn this game into a cult classic. I've logged about 45 hours into AstLibra, and I've rolled credits of a sort, though anyone who's played this game can attest that credit rolling may only be the start of your journey. But I've seen enough to say that this game is excellent, and I think more people need to know about it. I suspect that at least part of that obscurity is lent to the fact that AstLibra isn't exactly easy to pin down. What is AstLibra Revision, and who is it for? Well, it's got the god-killing and anime melodrama of a classic JRPG, but its gameplay doesn't really feel like one. It's got the 2D perspective, Alucard backdash, and even the backtracking of Metroidvania, but that backtracking isn't central to story progression, and even then, each chapter is set in its own isolated location. So while it does take inspiration from those two genres, what it is at its core and what makes it so easy to sink time into is the fact that it's an ARPG. It's a numbers go up game with the same sort of long-term progression hooks you'd expect to see in something like a Diablo. If you're willing to accept comparisons with multiplayer titles, then I think its closest cousins are Korean grinder MMOs like Dungeon Fighter Online and MapleStory. And all of that comparison is to help give us a starting point, because despite similarities to other titles, it truly is something all its own. It gives you the feeling that you've played a million games just like it, and yet you haven't touched anything like it in decades. AstLibra is some of the most fun I've had with the game all year, and here's why. Oh, Destiny, is this the world you wish for? Okay, it's definitely not a Game of the Year contender for me because of its story. Let's get this out of the way. You know whether or not this kind of JRPG storytelling is for you. It's not my thing, even in the best of cases, and here specifically, it really leans into what I can only describe as otaku pandering. This review is going to be gameplay focused, lest I spend half my script real estate whining about a game that I otherwise love. I need to sell you on this game because I think it does a terrible job at selling itself. Just look at how bizarre it looks. It's got these high-fidelity anime people walking on top of tileset textures made from real-world photographs, and parallax scrolling against landscapes that look like default Windows backgrounds. It grows on you, but its first impressions can be harsh. I don't think it vertical slices well, either, and the intro was so bad I hovered my cursor over the refund button before deciding to give it one final try. Sound like hyperbole? Let me explain. Okay, so here's what the first hour of AstLibra is like. When I first booted it up, the game says, "Hey, we really recommend you do the demo before you start. Do you want to do it?" And I said, sure. So I do the demo, get an introduction to the game's basic controls, and a preview of late game combat, see some powerful enemies, then finished it and get booted out to the main menu. So then the game asks, "Hey, do you now want to do the long, actionless intro sequence?" And for the sake of the review, I begrudgingly said yes, where I got a prologue as long and actionless as the game said it would be, during which the game tutorializes the same basic controls it did in the demo. Then after that, I'm booted to the main menu once more, and for the third time, after hitting the new game button, I finally get to start a new game, which once again introduces the controls and even has its own story prologue in and of itself. There's two takeaways to this anecdote. 1. The game can be bumpy, largely owed to the fact that it was produced by a solo dev. I said it was a great game, not a polished or consistent one. And 2. Skip all that intro stuff. AstLibra's insistence to onboard you with its least compelling elements is really baffling, and I think it'll turn a lot of people away. Even the combat-focused demo, while giving you a taste of the fighting, couldn't possibly illustrate the long-term progression systems that are feeding into that combat and making it all the more rewarding. You're probably waiting for where the excellent comes in, and I can tell you exactly where. It's when you get your first stick weapon and start hitting slimes. It's the step one towards something greater. It's the start from which all of your progression will stem, and from that start it feels really good. I have half a mind just to make the rest of this review 10 uncommentated minutes of me hitting things, but I'm going to do my best to have my words illustrate. The hit stop feels great. You get a small controller vibration and a freeze frame every time an enemy is struck. Coupled with this splash of special effects and damage numbers flying everywhere, the combat just nails the game feel. And that feel gets multiplied when your enemies are multiplied, with the effects stacking for every mob on screen so that when you're hitting a dozen foes, you're getting a dozen splash sound effects ringing in your ears, and it's just so juicy. That really feels like how you're supposed to play too, because of how forgiving attacking is. Enemies don't damage you just by walking into you. They very specifically need to perform an attack on you. This gives you this platformery flexibility in how you move and navigate combat spaces. You can jump right over enemies and get right up in their face to land swings consequence-free, as long as you're on the lookout for the visual and audio cues that tell you they're about to smack. Shields are really powerful in this game as well, allowing you to mitigate all damage as long as the shield holds, but the game has a more prevalent and universal damage mitigation technique: spells. So spells are required throughout the game and they can do a variety of things. You can have 4 or 5 equipped to your character at all time. Sometimes they'll be damage buffs and sometimes they'll be projectile damage attacks. Importantly is how you use them. They're all mapped to a single face button but can be pulled out by performing some very forgiving fighting game-like movement inputs. Usually just 2 directions on the D-pad followed by the button itself. What makes them forgiving is the fact that the game will freeze time when you try to input them, allowing you to try multiple times without consequence. And casting the spell will also make you temporarily invulnerable during its animation. The resource allowing you to cast spells is gained as you swing at monsters, giving you this builder-spender type alternation in attacks, where you try to time that spending with incoming damage so you go invulnerable, and only need to use your shields and dodges as a last resort. It gives encounters, especially boss fights, this perpetual aggression type feel. The battles are as much reflex-intense timing games as they are damage per second optimization tests, acting as a gate to prove you're tough enough or grounded enough to move forward. I love this combat and could do it all day. In fact, I've done so multiple times. But like I said before, that combat is enhanced by the ecosystems that it feeds into. Okay, so there are maybe like 4 or 5 different progression systems in this game depending on what you're counting. Killing enemies grants experience, which lets you level up and allocate stat points. But enemies also drop these colored orbs, which give you a separate menu where you can also spend those orbs to also get more stat points. Weapons, armor, and shields have their own experience bar, which can be progressed and unlock special abilities on the other side. You have this gem system wherein gems you find in the world give you extra bandwidth to utilize more and more passive buffs. And of course, the acquisition of new armor and weapons is progression in and of itself, with crafting materials dropping from monsters that can be combined with other bases like ore that you mine to make new gear. Is all of that overwhelming? Actually, not at all, and I think that's owed to a general no wrong answers approach to building your character. Everything is really forgiving and can be undone near consequence free. There's no fear of making a useless gimpy character, and that means there's no fear in how you spend your time and what you do. This is really where the game feels most like an MMO. There's this tangible numerical reward for every second you spend with AstLibra, and it's not insidious here because those seconds don't cost you anything, aside from its flat purchasing price, and I'm a huge fan of that. So structurally, AstLibra does some interesting things in terms of how its missions are laid out. After a prologue sequence, you'll be brought to the main town square that acts as the game's central hub. From here you can purchase items, equipment, and engage in a number of different side activities and challenges to earn more stuff. You can also backtrack to specific missions you've already completed via a portal in your house. But when it comes to moving forward and going to the next mission, you'll be brought into a place that's divorced from the hub, and you can't go back until you've completed it. That's definitely where the Metroidvania comparisons feel like they're at their weakest. This is definitely an episodic game, and not a grander singular location that can be traveled across at whim. Each of these missions has its own sub-story acting as an episode of AstLibra, and will also nudge the overarching story forward bit by bit each time. I think what's really important is how you navigate through each of these missions. This game is unabashedly retro, not just retro-inspired. If there's one gameplay-specific frustration that was present throughout my time, it was the puzzles. AstLibra loves being esoteric and arcane, and this is the one time where the retroness that makes the game so cool is just completely unwelcome for me. There's this you need to read the game developer's mind in order to progress type thing with some of these puzzles, and this game doesn't exactly have a ton of walkthroughs online yet for when you get stuck. Let me give you an example from the first chapter. So I'm trying to explore this cave, but my companion won't let me go in because I don't have a torch. So I see this bundle of wood right next to the cave entrance that looks like it's interactable, but I can't do anything with it. Which is a shame because I figured I could make a torch out of it with a crafting system, but I guess that's not the case. So I go back into town and I talk to everyone to see what I'm supposed to do. I start with the shopkeeper to see if he sells any torches or crafting recipes or anything like that, but nothing there. I talk to the barkeeper and nothing there either. There's this mysterious woman in town who keeps asking me if I'm looking for the magic anime MacGuffin scales, and nothing there either. So I spent like half an hour looking in every nook and cranny of this town and its surrounding forests, which was at least partially beneficial because I got some cool upgrades, but I was about to give up when I finally decided to talk to everyone a second time. Okay, so that woman who keeps asking about the scales, you have to tell her no, I'm not looking for them, which I thought would end our conversation, but for some reason now triggers the shopkeeper to tell you about crafting, and then you're allowed to go back to the cave entrance and pick up the wood to make a torch. There's like 4 or 5 different times I ran into a roadblock like that, and every time the answer wasn't some masterful revelation, but instead something that made me go, wow, that was really stupid. There's this indirectness to it. It's less about thinking about what the logical solution is, and more about thinking about what's the gamey solution. It's hard to explain, but if you have a low tolerance for old point-and-click adventure puzzles, then I'd say you might not dig the kind of solutioning this game expects of you. But those moments are a minority compared to the vast amount of hours I gleefully spent with this one. Sure, its retroness bites in the ass sometimes, but most of the time it's a welcome throwback. Apparently it had a 15-year dev cycle, and I believe it, because it is this time capsule of a game that stands out even among a sea of other games throwing back to that same era. With strong combat fundamentals, rewarding progression systems and exploration, retro vibes, and tons of content, this one should not be missed. It doesn't fit into conventional genre labels because it manages to be something entirely new, and simultaneously something very, very old. Because for good and bad, it doesn't feel like a throwback to PS1 RPGs, as much as it actually feels like it is one. It's like this long-lost ROM got dumped onto the internet after decades of myth and legend. It won't be for everyone, but for the folks that it is for, I hope you find it, and it finds you.